January 1942 wasn't just cold, it was brutal. The Russian winter was hitting its peak with an almost supernatural force, transforming the landscape into a world of ice and deathly silence. The trees, covered in frost, looked like petrified ghosts, and the thick snow muffled the sound of any movement. The rivers and lakes, once waterways, had become sheets of treacherous ice, glistening in the pale sun and reflecting the grey sky that never seemed to warm. Temperatures plummeted to below 30 degrees, and every breath created white clouds that quickly froze on the soldiers' clothes. The iron in their rifles froze, the powder became damp and ineffective, and even the air seemed to cut through their skin like thin blades. Every step in the deep snow was a silent battle, feet buried up to the knees, hands stiff and aching, bodies shivering incessantly, fighting hypothermia before even facing the enemy. The cold made no distinction between friend and foe. Soldiers of the Red Army and German troops suffered equally. Frostbite became common, with fingers and ears losing color and sensation, turning the simple act of firing a gun into a test of sheer endurance. Hunger and fatigue combined with the cold, creating a silent and relentless enemy that attacked even before the first shot was fired. And against this deadly backdrop, the battle had yet to begin. Every soldier knew that to survive, they would need to face the enemy, and the Russian winter itself, an adversary that showed no mercy. The biting wind, whistling between the destroyed buildings and through the frozen forests, carried with it shards of ice and the promise of slow death to those who hesitated. The ice of the Russian winter wasn't just a condition. It was a silent protagonist of the war, a cruel judge who punished the weak and tested the brave. There, in the icy, deathly silence, every breath was a reminder that survival was not guaranteed, and that courage would have to overcome death before the battle truly began. The siege tightens. As the cold tore at flesh and froze bones, the shadow of war loomed ever closer. The Red Army, merciless and determined, surrounded the German forces around Staraya Russa, creating an invisible but deadly ring. There was no escape. Every road was blocked by Soviet patrols. Every village was an observation post. Every tree, every snow-covered trunk could hide soldiers ready to attack. The German troops felt the siege tighten like an icy fist around their necks. Urgent messages arrived with orders for reinforcements, but they were often lost in the snow or intercepted by the enemy. The cold spared no one, and the lack of supplies made each day a struggle for survival. Scarce rations, frozen fuel, and limited ammunition. Many soldiers were forced to ration not only food, but also their energy, knowing that any slip-up could mean immediate death. Around Lake Ilmen, the ice became both a trap and an escape route. Isolated troops tried to cross its frozen lakes, only to sink as the ice sheet broke under the weight of their men and equipment. With each move, the tension mounted. The enemy could attack at any moment, and the feeling of no refuge made the air even heavier and more suffocating. On the horizon, the silence was deceptive. Amid the crackling ice and the biting wind, the first shots and distant explosions could be heard, foreshadowing a battle that would become epic. Each commander knew that survival depended not only on strategy, but on sheer human endurance. The siege was not just physical, it was psychological, slowly crushing the men's spirits, testing their courage and their will to fight to their last breath. The ice and snow made every movement painful and dangerous, transforming the battlefield into a deadly labyrinth. And in the midst of this desperation, the German soldiers prepared for a resistance that would be remembered not only for its violence, but for their absolute courage in the face of death that surrounded all sides. The siege was complete. There was no escape. The war would begin here, with every shot and every scream echoing through the biting cold, and Lake Ilmen would witness one of the last desperate acts of courage as men faced cold and death side by side. As the ice froze their hands, every decision could be their last. What would you do in their place? In the icy heart of Staraya Russa, German soldiers prepared for the most desperate stand of their lives, surrounded by enemies advancing from all sides, and the relentless winter that seemed intent on engulfing them. Each man knew that every second of hesitation could be fatal. Weapons at the ready, gazes fixed, and bodies trembling with cold, it was the image of soldiers facing death not as a distant possibility, but as a near certainty. The destroyed streets and houses became makeshift fortresses. Every burned-out building, every wooden barricade, and every trench dug in the snow was a silent promise. Here we will resist to the end. Soldiers hid behind frozen walls, firing back at any Soviet advance, but with each machine gun burst, they felt the weight of the cold stiffen their fingers, making it difficult to reload their weapons, and making it clear that the battle would not be just against the enemy, but against their own bodies. The smell of burning gunpowder mingled with the icy smell of snow and exposed flesh. Men fell, some from bullets, others from frostbite, and yet others kept fighting, clutching weapons, almost as cold as their hands, willing to face death for just a few more minutes of life. It was a desperate, violent, and chaotic battle where courage became as vital as ammunition. Every step the German soldiers took was calculated, but the unpredictability of the enemy and the frozen terrain turned every move into a deadly roulette wheel. Attack or retreat. The decision could mean survival or instant death. And all the while, the cold wind seemed to laugh at their efforts, seeping into the crevices of their clothes and skin, reminding them at every turn that the cold was a silent, constant enemy, as deadly as the Soviet soldiers surrounding the city. The German resistance was not just a line of defense, it was an act of desperate courage. Each man clung to hope, training, and camaraderie, knowing that victory might be impossible, but that honor demanded they fight to their last breath. And so, amid gunfire, explosions, and screams of pain, the city of Staraya Russa became a bloody stage where courage and desperation collided, and every moment survived was a victory against the ice, war, and death itself. The role of the Blue Division. Amidst the icy chaos of Staraya Russa, a group of Spanish soldiers stood out with an almost supernatural determination. The famous Blue Division, sent by Franco to fight alongside the German army, faced not only the Soviet enemy, but also the biting cold that seemed to sap the warmth from their bodies and the breath from their men. Each step in the deep snow was a titanic effort, but every soldier of the Blue Division was there with a single objective: to hold the line at any cost. These men, many of them veterans of the Spanish Civil War, brought with them combat experience that would prove vital. Well versed in military discipline and strategy, they became the backbone of the German defense. Amid gunfire, explosions, and screams of pain, the Spanish soldiers ran from position to position, reinforcing makeshift barricades, assisting wounded comrades, and firing back at any Soviet advance. Every move was precise. Every decision could mean the difference between the survival of dozens or certain death. The Blue Division's courage manifested itself in small, heroic gestures. Soldiers carrying comrades wounded by the ice to safety, others using their last grenades to repel attacks, even when they knew there would be no reinforcements. The cold didn't diminish their resolve. On the contrary, it seemed to galvanize them, transforming each act of resistance into an example of discipline and bravery. Despite being far from home, facing an unfamiliar winter and a relentless enemy, the Spanish soldiers displayed near-legendary resilience. Every machine gun burst they fired, every trench they defended, every position they held was a reminder that even when surrounded and outnumbered, courage could overcome despair. On the grand chessboard of Staraya Russa, the Blue Division became a strategic pillar, slowing the Soviet advance and ensuring that German soldiers could reorganize their defenses. Their presence not only strengthened the lines, but also inspired everyone around them, ordinary men transformed into temporary heroes by necessity and honor. Amid the biting cold, The deep snow and the crack of rifles, the Blue Division became a silent legend of Lake Ilmen. Warriors from a distant land fighting bravely against enemies and winter, knowing that every minute they held the line could save lives and keep the flame of hope alive amid despair. With every explosion, every gunfire, the price of courage revealed itself. Comment if you would have held your ground. The city of Staraya Russa, surrounded by the ice of Lake Ilmen and snow-covered forests, turned into a veritable hell. The Red Army advanced relentlessly, determined to break through the German lines and occupy the strategic city, while the defenders clung to every street, every house, every piece of barricade as if it were their last hope of survival. Rifle and machine gun fire echoed through the biting cold, mingled with the crunch of snow under heavy boots and the distant roar of cannons. Explosions sent shrapnel and pieces of wood flying through the streets, creating clouds of frozen smoke that blinded the soldiers and turned every corner into a minefield of death. It was a violent, unpredictable melee, where every decision could mean instant life or death. The German soldiers and the Blue Division moved with precision, defending each position with desperate ferocity. Makeshift barricades were constantly rebuilt as the enemy attempted to break through, and partially destroyed houses became temporary fortresses where resistance could last hours or minutes, depending on the luck and courage of the men inside. The cold was relentless. Men fell not only from bullets, but from frostbite, exhaustion, or untreatable wounds. Blood mixed with the snow, creating a macabre contrast. Life and death intertwined in the same icy landscape. Every scream of pain, every shouted command echoed through the deserted streets, creating a symphony of chaos and courage. In the city center, control changed hands repeatedly throughout the day. A building could be lost and recaptured in a matter of minutes, as the enemy relentlessly advanced in waves of soldiers, only to be repelled by concentrated fire and heroic sacrifice. Each Soviet advance was met with stubborn resistance. Each attempt to encircle a street met with desperate courage and calculated explosions. The battle for control of Staraya Russa was not merely strategic, it was a test of human endurance against the cold, the enemy, and death itself. Each soldier who remained standing, despite the losses and suffering, wrote a story of heroism that would echo far beyond the ice and snow, reminding us that even amidst the most brutal chaos, courage could flourish and defy destruction. This was just one battle. Want to see more stories of bravery and bloodshed? Hit like and stay with us. In Staraya Russa, the war transcended a mere confrontation between armies. It became a primal struggle against an omnipresent and relentless adversary, the Russian winter. This biting cold was not a passive environmental condition, but an active enemy, a silent killer that operated with brutal efficiency, attacking each soldier with the same ferocity as bullets and shrapnel. The freezing temperature, which often plummeted to unbearable levels, penetrated the thickest layers of clothing, freezing flesh and bone, transforming the human body into an internal battlefield where life was constantly threatened. Hands, once agile and capable of handling weapons with dexterity, trembled uncontrollably. Fingers became stiff, pale and insensitive, afflicted with advanced stages of frostbite, and the seemingly simple task of reloading a weapon, adjusting equipment, or even lighting a cigarette became a Herculean challenge against one's own physiology. Each movement required monumental effort, draining vital energy and eroding the morale of the combatants, who found themselves in a constant struggle for basic survival. Breathing became painful, the freezing air burning the lungs with each breath, and exhaustion quickly set in, not only from the physical exertion, but from the body's constant need to generate heat to stay alive, an internal struggle that consumed every fiber of the being. The body, in its desperate attempt to preserve core heat, restricted blood flow to the extremities, making them vulnerable and painfully exposed to frostbite, a constant and visible threat that could lead to the loss of fingers, hands or feet, and even death from gangrene. The skin, exposed to the icy wind, cracked and bled, creating open wounds that refused to heal in the hostile environment, and the constant pain became an inseparable companion, sapping concentration and the ability to react. The snow, falling relentlessly and accumulating to terrifying depths, not only made every step difficult, but also created treacherous and exhausting terrain. Walking through it was like trudging through a sea of heavy cotton, each advancing a test of endurance that consumed vital calories and depleted the last reserves of energy. The white, desolate landscape, though beautiful in its vastness, was a death trap, hiding bomb craters, barbed wire, and frozen bodies beneath its blanket, serving as macabre reminders of the fate that awaited those less fortunate. The piercing wind, laden with razor-sharp ice crystals, blew mercilessly through the makeshift trenches and ruined buildings, stealing any remaining heat that might have accumulated and exposing the soldiers to even more intense cold. Men fell without warning, not from combat wounds, but as silent victims of severe hypothermia, frostbite, or extreme exhaustion, their bodies succumbing to nature's indifference, turning into statues of ice. The blood oozing from open wounds, a brutal testament to the violence of war, froze almost instantly, turning torn tissue into rigid, painful lumps, intensifying suffering and hindering any attempt at medical aid, which often came too late or was impossible due to the insurmountable conditions. Frozen wounds were more susceptible to infection and gangrene, transforming the battlefield into an open-air hospital where death lurked around every corner, and amputation became a common but devastating life-saving solution, leaving lasting physical and psychological scars that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The simple task of sleeping was a challenge, as the cold penetrated sleeping bags and clothing, turning rest into a battle against uncontrollable shivering and the fear of not waking up. Military tactics and strategies were constantly shaped and subverted by the ever-present presence of cold. Equipment that functioned perfectly in mild climates failed miserably. Weapons jammed, firing mechanisms froze, and maintenance became a near impossible task with numb and stiff fingers, requiring superhuman effort to maintain functionality. Oils and lubricants solidified, turning machine guns and rifles into useless lumps of metal. Explosives, designed as tools of destruction, became unstable and unpredictable, with the risk of failure to detonate, or worse, accidental detonation, endangering soldiers' lives and compromising crucial operations. Wet gunpowder, an inevitable consequence of damp and icy conditions, failed to ignite, rendering weapons inoperable at the most critical moments of an attack or defense, turning armed soldiers into easy, defenseless targets at the mercy of the enemy and the weather. Motor vehicles, lubricants, and fuels froze, turning into immobile and useless husks, paralyzing logistics and the transportation of troops and supplies, further isolating units on the front line and making retreat nearly impossible. The lack of mobility meant that the wounded often died where they fell, with no hope of evacuation. Even communication between units, vital for combat coordination, was hampered by the deafening howl of the wind and the cracking of the ice, which muffled voices and distorted messages, further isolating combatants and creating an environment of uncertainty and disorganization. Every military decision had to consider winter not merely as a backdrop, but as an active enemy, striking with cruel and merciless precision, dictating the terms of battle, enforcing constant and often desperate adaptations, where creativity and resilience were tested to the limits of human capacity, and failure meant certain, icy death. The cold, in its brutal indifference, chose no sides. German soldiers, the volunteers of the Spanish Blue Division, and Soviet troops suffered equally under its yoke. This equality of suffering made each engagement all the more desperate, as the struggle for survival against the environment often outweighed the struggle against the human enemy. Casualties from non-combat causes were alarming, in many cases exceeding direct losses from enemy fire, and morale was constantly tested by deprivation and unrelenting discomfort. The prospect of a slow, painful death from frostbite or hypothermia was as terrifying as that of being struck by a bullet, and often more prolonged and agonizing, stripping the individual of their dignity and transforming them into mere objects of suffering. There were times when men were left behind, their exhausted and frozen bodies unable to continue, forcing their comrades to make agonizing decisions between pressing forward to complete the mission or attempting a rescue that could cost even more lives. The line between courage and recklessness became blurred, and humanity was tested to its most extreme limits, revealing the fragility of life in the face of relentless nature and the cruelty of the choices that war imposed, where compassion was a luxury rarely allowed, and individual survival became the highest priority, even if it meant abandoning a comrade. Yet amid all this horror and despair, human courage persisted and was tested at every turn. Those who withstood the extreme cold, who continued fighting despite excruciating pain, overwhelming exhaustion, hunger, and the constant threat of death, transcended the human condition, becoming almost superhuman figures. They held the lines of defense, prevented the enemy from seizing vital positions, and demonstrated a resilience that defied logic and nature itself. Camaraderie became a shield against despair, and the determination to protect comrades in arms provided extra strength to endure the unbearable, creating indestructible bonds forged in shared suffering and the certainty that only together could they have any chance of overcoming the icy hell. The Russian winter, with its unparalleled ferocity, transformed every battle into a brutal spectacle of survival, where willpower, camaraderie, and courage had to overcome imminent death at every turn. The biting cold was not just an environmental condition. It was an invisible adversary, a ruthless judge who punished the weak and honored the strong. And in the icy, snow-covered landscapes of Staraya Russa, each soldier learned that the war was not just against the visible enemy, but against winter itself, which seemed determined to vanquish anyone who dared face it, exacting a toll of life, sanity, and, for many, their very souls, leaving deep scars that would last long beyond the conflict's end, shaping the memory and history of a generation and a nation, and forever inscribing the lesson that nature can be the most formidable of enemies. Lake Ilmen witnessed courage and sacrifice. Share if you honor these men. As the German and Blue Division defenders fought desperately to survive the cold and chaos within the ruins of Staraya Russia, the Red Army advanced with ruthless precision and iron determination, executing an encirclement strategy that would prove devastating. The Soviet-imposed encirclement was not merely a troop movement around a city, it was a meticulously planned strategy designed to slowly crush the enemy, cut off their vital supply lines, and methodically wear down their resistance to the point of total collapse. It was a masterful display of strategic patience, brute force, and a profound understanding of attrition warfare, where time was as powerful an ally as any armored division, and geography became a weapon to be exploited with mastery and ruthlessness. Soviet encirclement doctrine, honed in countless battles on the Eastern Front, aimed not merely at territorial conquest, but at the complete annihilation of enemy forces, transforming the encircled area into a cauldron of despair and destruction. The Soviets spread out cunningly around the city, using the dense forest cover, strategic hilltops, and nearby villages as vantage points and camouflage. They created a network of invisible but lethal blockades that turned every road, every trail, and every access route into a deadly route for anyone who dared to cross it. This web of territorial control not only prevented reinforcements and supplies from entering, but also blocked any attempt to escape, transforming the city into an open-air prison whose walls were made of snow, ice, and enemy fire, and whose guards were relentless, vigilant, and numerous. Reconnaissance and combat patrols advanced silently under the cover of snow and darkness, surprising isolated and disorganized German units, sowing panic and demoralization among the enemy ranks, who felt constantly watched and vulnerable, unsure of where the next attack would come from, when, or with what force. Simultaneously, Soviet heavy artillery hammered relentlessly at enemy defensive positions, unleashing a hail of shells that mingled with the frozen snow, transforming the landscape into a hell of debris, shrapnel, and craters, undermining fortifications, destroying shelters, and eroding the morale of the defenders, who found themselves under relentless bombardment. A macabre symphony of explosions and screams echoing across the frozen landscape, a constant reminder of the inevitability of their fate and the futility of their resistance. Soviet snipers, camouflaged in the snow, added an extra layer of terror, hunting officers and messengers with deadly precision. The Soviet encirclement operated like a constant and inexorable pressure machine, a vise that gradually tightened, depriving the enemy of air and resources. Every German advance, every attempted counterattack was anticipated and expected by Soviet commanders, who had meticulously studied the terrain, enemy tactics, and movement patterns, utilizing intelligence and aerial reconnaissance, often obtained through local spies and informants who risked their lives to provide crucial information. The Soviet intelligence network was vast and efficient, providing an invaluable advantage. Every attempt to break out or reinforce was blocked by well-positioned and camouflaged Soviet units, ready to attack with machine guns, grenades, and concentrated artillery fire, turning breakout attempts into bloody and demoralizing massacres, where hope faded with every casualty and every body that fell to the snow. The city, now completely surrounded on all sides, became a death trap, where every position the defenders secured was quickly threatened by new and incessant attacks, forcing them into an exhausting and relentless defense, consuming resources and precious lives with each passing hour. The feeling of being trapped, with no way out, was as heavy a psychological burden as the physical, driving many to despair, madness, and in some cases, suicide, while the discipline and cohesion of the enemy units crumbled under the pressure. The intense cold, already an enemy in itself, further intensified the suffering of the besieged, making survival a double battle against the visible enemy and against the relentless nature itself. The shortages of food, fuel, and medical supplies, exacerbated by the siege, turned hunger, disease, and frostbite into Soviet allies, decimating the troops without the need for a single shot. Rats and disease proliferated in the unsanitary conditions, adding another layer of horror to daily existence, and the lack of basic hygiene led to outbreaks of typhus and dysentery, which spread rapidly among the weakened troops. Isolated troops were forced to fight to the last man or surrender to the mercy of cold, hunger, and hopelessness, often without the dignity of a fair fight, succumbing to a slow and painful death, their bodies becoming part of the frozen landscape, a grim warning to those still resisting. Communication between German units, already precarious due to the destruction of infrastructure and enemy interference, was further hampered by the piercing howl of the wind and the deep snow, which made messages inaudible and orders confusing, fragmenting the chain of command and preventing any effective coordination. Every messenger or vehicle attempting to cross Soviet lines ran a huge risk of being shot down, making the siege even more suffocating and isolating the defenders from any hope of outside help. This created a feeling of abandonment and despair that eroded the soldiers' will to fight and their very identity, transforming them into mere shadows of their former selves, starving and frozen ghosts. For the Soviets, patience was as deadly and effective a weapon as any cannon or machine gun. They understood that over time, cold, hunger, exhaustion, and desperation would inexorably erode German resistance, sapping not only their physical fighting ability, but also their will and spirit. Every attack, every ambush, every slow and calculated advance aimed not only to sap the defenders' physical strength, but also to destroy their morale, transforming the battle into a game of extreme attrition, where psychological resilience was as important as fighting ability. The Soviet siege transformed Staraya Russa into a field of continuous tension, where every moment was a struggle for survival, a test of physical and mental limits. The city became not only a strategic point of military importance, but a stage where courage, strategy, sacrifice, and the brutality of war collided, demonstrating that victory is achieved not by weapons alone, but by strategic patience, meticulous planning, and the relentless determination to crush the enemy whatever the cost, until the last resistance was broken and the city fell, marking another chapter in the brutality of the Eastern Front and the dark history of World War II. A testament to the human capacity to endure the unbearable and inflict unimaginable suffering, and to the cold, calculating strategy that used the environment itself as an instrument of war. The fall of Staraya Russa, when it finally occurred, would be the result not just of a military assault, but of a slow, agonizing asphyxiation, where winter and the Soviet siege combined to seal the fate of the besieged. Courage on the front lines, the indomitable spirit in Staraya Russa. On the frozen streets and makeshift trenches of Staraya Russa, courage was not an abstract virtue to be admired, but a visceral necessity, a driving force measured in every second of precarious existence. German soldiers and the volunteers of the Blue Division, many of them hailing from milder climates and unprepared for the brutality of the Russian winter, faced not only a relentless and numerous human enemy, but also the extreme cold that penetrated to the soul and the constant explosions that tore through the frigid air, transforming the landscape into a white hell. Despite it all, they fought on, wielding rifles and grenades with stiff, ice-numb hands, every movement a searing agony, every muscle fiber protesting the task. Every shot fired was an act of desperation and determination, every cautious advance into enemy territory, a gamble against death, every charge against a fortified position, a show of pure, desperate bravery in the face of a death that seemed almost certain, a constant, palpable shadow that hung over every step, every breath. Hand-to-hand combat, a primal and inhuman brutality, raged amid the smoking rubble of destroyed buildings and snow-covered barricades, transforming the urban landscape into a deadly maze of twisted iron and pulverized concrete. Men fell, screamed in wrenching agony, and in an act of sheer resilience that defied logic, rose again, driven by the adrenaline pumping furiously through their veins and the primal instinct for survival that refused to relent. The blood that stained the white snow, transforming it into a grotesque scarlet mosaic, not only demonstrated the unspeakable brutality of the conflict, but also symbolized human resilience in the face of overwhelming forces, a silent, bloody declaration that, even in the face of total annihilation, the human spirit could persist, stubbornly, against all odds. There were moments of heroism that defied logic and reason itself, acts of sacrifice that transcended duty. One soldier, his body exhausted, his lungs burning with every breath of icy air, and his mind clouded by deprivation, would run for miles across a battlefield ravaged by bullets and shrapnel, just to deliver a vital message that could change the course of a small skirmish or save an entire unit from annihilation. Another, with a strength that seemed to come from a place beyond the physical, would carry a wounded and unconscious comrade across the frozen field, aware that each step could be their last, but driven by an unbreakable bond of camaraderie forged in a shared hell. Every gesture, every sacrifice, every act of selfless altruism was a powerful affirmation that determination could overcome, even momentarily, the death that lurked around every corner. A flickering flame of Hope amidst the deepest darkness, a reminder of the humanity that still existed beneath the shell of war. The cold, a constant, insidious and relentless enemy, added to the weight of every movement, making simple tasks like reloading a weapon, advancing through snow-covered terrain, or even breathing a nearly impossible challenge. With each breath, the frigid air burned the lungs, causing pain and coughing, and with each exhalation, a dense cloud of frozen vapor formed, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the proximity of death. Still, courage persisted, and small groups of men, often isolated with few resources and no hope of reinforcements, resisted with fierce tenacity, holding key positions against waves of Soviet attacks. In doing so, they slowed the enemy advance and, crucially, saved thousands of lives by keeping strategic corridors open for precious moments, allowing other units to retreat or regroup. They were the pillars of the resistance, the last line of defense against the red tide, sacrificing themselves to give their comrades a chance. The front lines were the stage for an epic and desperate struggle between hope and despair, where every soldier knew that any hesitation, any moment of weakness could mean instant and inglorious death. But despite this terrifying knowledge, they pressed on, protecting each other with unwavering loyalty, defending every street, every house, every patch of ground with almost superhuman ferocity, transforming every ruin into a makeshift fortress, every rubble into a defensive position. Mutual loyalty, the desire to survive together, and belief in the cause, however tenuous, were the driving forces that drove them on, even when their bodies and minds cried out for surrender, when exhaustion was total and hope seemed vanished. In those moments of unspeakable chaos, relentless snow and bloodshed, war showed its most brutal and, paradoxically, its most heroic face. Courage on the front lines was not just about passively enduring adversity. It was about defying the impossible, fighting the cold that froze the flesh and stole life, the enemy that sought total annihilation, and the death that lurked in every shadow, in every gust of wind. It was about making every second survived a testament to the human spirit in the face of total destruction, a testament to the ability to endure the unbearable and find strength where there seemed to be none, leaving a legacy of sacrifice, resilience, and humanity that would echo through history. A somber and inspiring reminder of the complexity of the human experience in times of war. The Luftwaffe intervention, a ray of hope in the icy sky of Staraya Russa. As German troops and the Blue Division held out desperately in the frozen streets and smoking rubble of Staraya Russa, the sky above the city became another battlefield, a stage for crucial and often decisive intervention. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, sprang into action in a desperate and risky attempt to relieve the crushing pressure on the encircled defenders who were on the verge of collapse. Fighter planes and bombers, such as Messerschmitts and Stukas, sliced through the frigid air, their engines roaring like mechanical beasts, a sound that, for the besieged on the ground, was a symphony of hope and, for the Soviets, an omen of death. They dropped bombs with deadly accuracy and fired machine guns and cannons at the Soviet positions, desperately trying to break the siege ring and open a path to salvation, or at least survival. Each airstrike was a terrifying and brutal spectacle, a demonstration of the fury of war seen from above, with the earth exploding in geysers of snow and debris. Explosions sent debris, ice and snow flying, creating clouds of frozen smoke that blinded defenders and attackers alike, adding a layer of confusion and disorientation to the already existing chaos. Houses crumbled in clouds of dust and shrapnel. Barricades were pulverized in seconds, and the ground seemed to tremble under the deafening impact of the bombs, reverberating the violence throughout the city, transforming it into an apocalyptic landscape. The deafening roar of aircraft and explosions mingled with the cracking of ice, the screams of wounded soldiers, and the sound of ground combat, transforming every moment into absolute chaos, where life and death were decided in fractions of a second, and luck was as crucial a factor as skill. Luftwaffe pilots faced a nearly impossible mission, a challenge that required not only exceptional flying skill, but also unwavering courage and remarkable improvisation. They had to identify targets amid the snow that covered the landscape, camouflaging enemy positions, and the dense smoke rising from ground combat, obscuring visibility. Furthermore, the extreme cold threatened the aircraft's delicate mechanisms, freezing navigation instruments, weapons, and even flight controls, making navigation and attack extremely dangerous and unpredictable. Each precise hit could save dozens of lives on the ground, relieving pressure on besieged units and allowing them to breathe. But each mistake could result in tragedy, destroying allies or leaving strategic positions even more exposed to the enemy. A constant risk that weighed heavily on every decision made, thousands of meters above sea level. From the ground, the soldiers looked up with a complex and contradictory mix of hope and terror. The arrival of German bombers and fighters meant the possibility of retaking ground, of breaking the Soviet lines, and of easing the relentless pressure of the siege. It was a glimmer of salvation, a sign that they had not been forgotten, that help was on the way. But it was also a brutal reminder that they were trapped in a deadly siege and that every moment could be their last, regardless of air support. Explosions ripped through the frigid air, and fragments of metal and wood fell like bloody rain onto the frozen. A battlefield, adding further danger to an already hellish environment. The presence of the Luftwaffe was a bittersweet reminder of the precariousness of their situation, a temporary reprieve that did not guarantee final victory, but merely another chance to fight. Despite the devastation and inherent risks, the Luftwaffe's intervention brought a temporary and invaluable advantage to the defenders. The airstrikes allowed some German units to reorganize, taking advantage of the confusion created to reinforce barricades, consolidate defensive positions, and, crucially, evacuate wounded who would otherwise have been doomed to death from frostbite, lack of treatment, or exposure to enemy fire. This momentary respite, though brief and often insufficient to change the overall course of the battle, was vital to maintaining resistance, allowing soldiers to regain some breath and morale. However, the Soviet encirclement remained firm, a ring of steel and ice that refused to give way, and the biting cold continued to attack with the same lethality as the enemy weapons, ensuring that the fight for survival continued relentlessly, day after day, night after night. The Luftwaffe was not just a force of destruction, it was a glimmer of hope amid despair, a reminder that even surrounded and outnumbered, individual courage and strategic coordination could create opportunities for survival in a landscape of chaos and death. In the skies above Staraya Russa, fire and ice met in a deadly ballet, a dance of destruction and salvation, and every second of relief the planes brought was one with blood, heroism, and immense human cost, a testament to tenacity and sacrifice in one of history's most brutal theaters of war, where the line between life and death was as thin as smoke in the frigid air. The fight for the last refuge, the final agony in Staraya Russa, as the Soviet siege tightened with relentless tenacity, turning Staraya Russia into a death trap. The German soldiers and volunteers of the Blue Division were forced into a progressive and painful retreat to their last defensive positions. Every ruined building, every makeshift barricade of frozen rubble, every stretch of street covered in snow and blood became a desperate refuge, the last point where they could attempt to resist the enemy's relentless tide. The city, once a strategic center, was now a labyrinth of death and despair, where every square meter was fought over with brutal ferocity. Positions were marked not by flags, but by piles of bodies and debris, and the hope of a counterattack or rescue faded with each passing hour, replaced by grim resignation and a fierce determination to sell one's life dearly. The biting cold, an enemy as lethal as Soviet bullets, continued to attack each man with unrelenting cruelty. Frozen fingers, swollen and numb, could barely squeeze triggers, turning the simple act of firing a weapon into torment. Bodies rigid with ice shivered uncontrollably as soldiers tried to advance or defend positions, hypothermia eroding their strength and reasoning, leading to fatal errors. Men fell, some wounded by bullets and shrapnel, others silently succumbing to winter itself, their bodies becoming part of the frozen landscape. But those who remained fought with almost superhuman determination, a stubbornness forged in desperation and a refusal to surrender. Every shot, every grenade thrown with a last-ditch effort, every movement calculated to conserve energy and avoid exposure, could mean precious minutes of survival, a postponement of the death that seemed inevitable. Hunger and thirst, combined with the cold, undermined resistance, transforming each day into an eternity of suffering, where the only source of warmth was the fire of weapons and the camaraderie of companions. The streets of Staraya Russa were unrecognizable, an apocalyptic scene of total destruction. Burnt-out buildings, their twisted, skeletonized structures, stood like monuments to violence, their empty windows like eyes that had witnessed the horror. Destroyed barricades of brick, wood, and frozen bodies marked the points of resistance that had been overcome, each telling a story of courage and sacrifice. Bodies strewn across the red-tinged snow, some partially buried, others exposed to the fury of the elements, were a macabre testament to the carnage, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. It was a scene where every refuge was won with blood and sacrifice, and human life had little value. The soldiers used what supplies they had left, improvising traps with whatever they could find, burning furniture and any combustible material to generate an ephemeral and fleeting heat, and reinforcing barricades with frozen debris in a relentless struggle against time, the enemy, and nature itself. The last refuge wasn't just physical, it was also deeply psychological, a battle waged in every soldier's mind. Each man knew deep down that he was surrounded, that outside help might not arrive in time, or perhaps never. The prospect of surrender, which often meant a slow death in a prison camp, or a slow, agonizing death from wounds or frostbite, loomed large. Survival depended on individual courage and collective discipline amidst absolute chaos, on the ability to maintain sanity when everything around them crumbled and hope became a luxury. Still, they resisted. Soldiers moved silently among makeshift trenches and rubble, aiding the wounded with what they could, sharing their last rations and ammunition, covering retreating comrades, and repelling relentless attacks from the enemy, who drew closer by the hour, by the minute. Camaraderie, forged in the fires of combat and the ice of winter, was the last link that held them together, a silent promise not to abandon each other, to fight to the end, side by side. The siege made every minute more tense, every second an eternity of suspense and terror. Explosions rent the air with terrifying frequency. Bullets whizzed through the deserted streets, ricocheting off the destroyed walls with a sharp, deadly sound, and the cold froze any hesitation, any flicker of fear that might arise, for immobility was synonymous with death. The last refuge was a thin, fragile line between life and death, and each successful defense, each position held against all odds, represented incredible human resilience in the face of overwhelming forces, a momentary victory against the inevitable. With each repulsed attack, a small spark of hope was rekindled, only to be threatened again by the next assault in an endless cycle of violence and survival. Even at the brink of despair, when physical and mental exhaustion reached their peak and death seemed the only way out, courage blossomed in unexpected and inspiring ways. Every soldier who held their shelter, who refused to give an inch of ground, who looked death in the eye and did not retreat, demonstrated that, even surrounded by the enemy and the deadly winter, the will to survive and protect their comrades could transform snow and blood into a nearly invincible barrier. Staraya Russa thus became the stage for a legendary resistance, where every minute gained was a victory against the impossible, a testament to the tenacity of the human spirit in the face of total annihilation, a dark and heroic chapter in the history of war, etched in the memory of the few who survived, and in the desolate landscape of the city, a silent monument to resilience and sacrifice. The Soviet determination. On the opposing side, the Red Army gave no quarter. Every Soviet soldier advanced with cruel and stubborn discipline, pressing the German lines to the limit. For them, every minute counted. Every refuge the Germans had conquered had to be taken at any cost. There was no pause, no mercy, only the relentless advance toward victory. Soviet troops used the frozen terrain to their advantage. They used snow-covered forests for ambushes partially, frozen rivers for quick sieges, and every damaged building as an observation point. Heavy artillery rained down on the last German defensive positions, sending shrapnel of metal and wood flying in clouds of smoke and ice. Explosions echoed through the deserted streets, and the crackling of ice beneath soldiers' feet mingled with the sound of destruction. Even in the face of deadly cold, deep snow and biting wind, Soviet soldiers advanced in calculated waves. Each attack was coordinated, each move planned to wear down enemy resistance. Patience was as deadly a weapon as any rifle, and Soviet commanders knew that in time, cold and hunger would take their toll on the German defenders. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers watched the enemy advance relentlessly, knowing that each retreat pushed them deeper into the encirclement and into the merciless cold. Each lost position meant more than territory. It was a blow to morale, a cruel reminder that the Red Army's pressure was constant and crushing. But Soviet determination wasn't just about brute force. It combined discipline, strategy, and patience, transforming the siege into a slow-burning machine, where cold, hunger, and relentless pressure became silent allies. Each successful advance pushed the German defenders further to the limit, demonstrating that on the ice and snow of Staraya, Russia, courage had to be met with an enemy's almost inhuman determination. The city became a theater of resistance and sacrifice, and every minute of German survival was won with titanic effort. For the Soviets, it was not just a battle, it was the certainty that patience, discipline, and collective courage could crush any obstacle, human or natural, and transform the siege into an inevitable strategic victory. The collapse of the German defenses. After days of incessant fighting, extreme cold, and constant pressure, the German defense lines began to give way. What had once been sturdy barricades, fortified houses, and strategic positions became a mosaic of rubble, frozen blood, and exhausted hope. Each Soviet advance seemed to crush the resistance a little further, and each German machine gun burst was less effective, the soldiers too exhausted to respond with the same ferocity. The ice and snow, which had previously partially protected the defenders, now became nearly insurmountable obstacles. Short ammunition, frozen bodies, wounded men, and extreme exhaustion turned every shot into a titanic effort. Some soldiers, paralyzed by the cold or the loss of comrades, were cut down without even being able to react, while others continued to fight, clinging to every second of survival as if it were gold. The collapse didn't happen suddenly. It was a slow and bloody process. Houses were taken, barricades torn down, streets conquered. The enemy advanced with determination, exploiting every breach, pressing the last German forces into corners of the city where resistance became impossible. The roar of Soviet cannons mingled with the cracking of ice and screams of pain, creating a deadly symphony of chaos and destruction. Despite the adversity, bravery did not fade. Some soldiers fought to the last shot, while others improvised defenses with the remains of barricades, trying to buy time for an organized retreat. Every second of resistance was an act of heroism, a refusal to surrender even when defeat seemed inevitable. The collapse of the German defenses marked the turning point of the battle. It wasn't just the loss of territory. It was the end of any hope of resisting the encirclement. The Red Army advanced decisively, while cold, hunger and exhaustion combined to crush any remaining resistance. Staraya Russa was about to change hands, and the ice of Lake Ilmen became a silent witness to the crushing force of Soviet resolve and the brutal human cost of war. The withdrawal of German troops. With defenses collapsing and the Soviet encirclement becoming insurmountable, German commanders made the difficult decision to order a retreat. But it wasn't an organized, safe retreat. It was a desperate escape through ice, deep snow, and constant enemy fire. Every step was a struggle against death, the cold, and despair itself. The streets of Staraya Russa were filled with tired, wounded, and frozen soldiers, trying to retreat as explosions and gunfire pursued them. Equipment was abandoned, vehicles got stuck in the snow, and confusion spread among the troops. Some men were left behind, unable to keep up while comrades struggled to help them, risking their own lives. The cold remained a relentless enemy. Frozen fingers couldn't grip weapons. Icy feet made running difficult, and extreme exhaustion made every movement an almost superhuman effort. At the same time, the Soviets pressed relentlessly, cutting off escape routes, ambushing columns, and capturing prisoners. Every attempt to escape was paid for with blood and sacrifice. Even in the retreat, acts of heroism emerged. Soldiers carried the wounded, held temporary positions to allow others to advance, and faced waves of enemy attacks with desperate courage. Every meter gained in the retreat was a victory over death. But it also reminded them that war exacted its toll with brutality and mercilessness. In the end, the retreat transformed Staraya Russa into a scene of utter destruction. Abandoned streets, burned buildings, scattered bodies, and the ice of Lake Ilmen reflecting the somber silence of a city that had witnessed courage, desperation, and bloodshed in epic quantities. The Soviet siege remained firm, and the German defeat, though painful, highlighted the brutal human cost of every decision, every act of courage, and every second of survival amidst the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. The strategic impact. The fall of Staraya Russa was not just a local victory for the Red Army. It was a significant blow to German strategy on the Eastern Front. The successful encirclement meant that the 16th Army's advance plans were halted, supply lines were cut, and the ability to sustain future operations in the region was drastically reduced. Each territorial defeat undermined German troop morale and strengthened Soviet resolve. The victory at Staraya Russa sent a clear message. The Eastern Front would not be conquered easily. The Russian winter, combined with the Red Army's patience and discipline, proved as lethal as any army, and each battle fought there made it clear that the war would be long, brutal, and relentless. For the German High Command, the defeat highlighted strategic flaws and the need to rethink future operations, while for the Soviets, it reinforced the belief that courage and resilience could turn the tide. Beyond the military impact, there was the human cost. Thousands of soldiers on both sides fell in the ice and snow. Wounded, frozen and dead, transformed the region into a silent cemetery, reminding everyone that war is not measured solely by conquered territory, but by the price humanity pays in blood. Every Soviet strategic victory was marked by the courage of ordinary men facing extraordinary conditions, and every German defeat reflected not only tactical failures, but the brutal effects of the cold and the enemy's relentless resistance. Staraya Russa thus became an example of the complexity of warfare on the Eastern Front, a battle where strategy, courage, patience, and human sacrifice intertwined. and where victory depended not only on weapons, but on the ability to endure extreme conditions, survive the deadly ice, and maintain resolve in the face of overwhelming forces. 15. The legacy of the battle. When the snow finally began to soften with the arrival of a less severe winter, Staraya Russa remained forever scarred. Burnt ruins, streets covered in ice and blood, and the heavy silence of Lake Ilmen testified to the colossal cost of the battle. But beyond the destruction, the indelible legacy of courage, resilience, and sacrifice remained. The soldiers who fought there, whether on the German side or with the Blue Division and the Red Army, had faced the impossible, deadly cold, hunger, exhaustion, and a relentless enemy. Every act of bravery, from defending makeshift barricades to running across the ice to save wounded comrades, showed that war was not just about strategy or numbers, but about the human spirit in its most extreme form. For the Eastern Front, the Battle of Lake Ilmen became a symbol of the strength of Soviet resistance and the fragility of German forces in the face of a combination of a determined enemy and a brutal winter. Strategically, the Soviet victory slowed German operations and demonstrated that patience and discipline could overcome brute force, redefining the course of the war in that region. But the legacy was not just military. Staraya Russa became a silent testament to the human cost of war. Hundreds of bodies buried in the ice served as a reminder that every victory and every defeat carried with them stories of ordinary men transformed into heroes through sacrifice. Each survivor bore physical and emotional scars, reminding the world that courage is measured not only in victories, but in the ability to endure in the face of absolute despair. Today, Lake Ilmen and the streets of Staraya Russa stand as silent memorials, reminding us that war, with all its brutality and glory, is fought by men and women facing relentless forces, both human and natural. The last stand on the Russian ice was not just a battle, it was a test of courage, a mirror of human brutality and heroism, and an unforgettable chapter in the history of World War II. The Battle of Staraya Russa, fought beneath the bitter cold of Lake Ilmen, was not just a clash of armies, it was a duel between human courage and nature itself. The ice, snow, and merciless wind became silent enemies, testing each soldier to the limits of their physical and emotional endurance. The relentless and disciplined Red Army showed that patience and strategy can overcome brute force, while the German defenders and the Blue Division demonstrated extraordinary heroism, sacrifice, and determination in the face of the impossible. More than territory or tactics, what remains is the human legacy of the battle, stories of courage, camaraderie, and survival amid death, reminding us that even in the most brutal scenarios, courage flourishes. Staraya Russa has become a symbol of the price of war, the strength of the human spirit, and the memory of those who faced cold, hunger, and the enemy without hesitation. In the end, Lake Ilmen remains silent, reflecting the cold Russian sky, but also forever carrying the memories of men who, despite being surrounded and exhausted, fought with everything they had, and proved that true courage is revealed in the darkest moments when hope seems almost impossible.